Hello, I'm Jonasz Rawiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Russia's army is battered in Ukraine, and its economy is somewhat bound by sanctions. But when reality looks grim, the Kremlin does what it does best: put on a show. Welcome to Zapad 2025, giant war games with Belarus, a splash of African guest stars, and a heavy dose of political theater. Because last Friday, Russia and Belarus kicked off Zapad 2025, their biggest military exercises of the year, and on paper, it's all about training. But in practice, it's about politics, and more importantly, about spectacle. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
This is Zapad 2025. These joint military exercises between Russia and Belarus, taking place on NATO's eastern flank, are testing the alliance's nerve after what has been a rather difficult week. Russian authorities call these exercises defensive in nature, but the tactics and strategies tested in the course of the drills are anything but, according to Western observers and officials. In fact, the previous Zapad 2021 drills were used as cover for the invasion of Ukraine.
For now, we have no indication that Zapad 2025 involves preparations for an attack under the guise of exercises. But we are vigilant.
The aggressive scenarios that are being tested as part of Zapad 2025 involve attacks on NATO countries such as Lithuania or Poland. Although an immediate assault seems out of the question, Polish officials have still completely shut down the border with Belarus. They also have a very sobering message to share.
The biggest threat is that the Russians do what they exercise. They exercised invading Georgia, and they did it. They exercised invading Ukraine, and they've done it.
This year's edition of the drills is much smaller than 4 years ago and involves only some 30,000 soldiers, most likely due to Russian forces being tied to the front lines in Ukraine.
And now we're zoning in on the East-splaining portion of our show. The eyes of the West are on the Zapad exercises between Russia and Belarus for a very good reason. The previous edition of the drills, Zapad 2021, is seen as a precursor and preparation for the invasion of Ukraine.
Zapad 2021 commenced in September as usual. Out of the ordinary, however, was the number of troops and equipment involved. The 2025 edition only concerned some 30,000 soldiers. The 2017 edition even fewer, around 13,000, while the 2021 edition involved over 200,000 military personnel, the same number to which the initial Russian invasion force amounted to in February 2022. Zapad 2021 also saw the use of several types of equipment for the first time, such as reconnaissance and strike UAVs. Western analysts had already suspected ulterior motives behind the Zapad series of exercises, which have been conducted regularly since 2009. The drills were usually focused on a conflict with a fictional European and most likely NATO-aligned country. American intelligence, given not just the unprecedented post-Cold War scale, but also the duration of the 2021 drills, began to believe that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could be imminent, as Russian rhetoric towards the country was taking on a much darker tone.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. The Zapad military exercises, with Zapad standing for West, are a regular Russian tradition, and they have always been as much about intimidating NATO as about testing Russian readiness. But this year feels different. Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, so why hold enormous drills right now? Because for Vladimir Putin, the show must go on. Think of Zapad 2025 less like an exercise and more like a theater production. The script is designed in Moscow, the stage is Belarus, and the audience is everyone from NATO generals to African leaders and, of course, the Russian public. This time, the Kremlin added a new twist. African soldiers are also taking part. Troops from countries that Russia has been cultivating through arms sales, mercenary deployments and anti-colonial rhetoric are now marching alongside Russian and Belarusian forces. It's supposed to send a message: Russia is not isolated, Russia has friends. Russia is leading a global anti-Western front. Now, African participation is tiny in military terms. By the way, so is the Indian participation, which is about 60 Indian soldiers altogether. But all of that makes for great propaganda footage. Expect Russian state TV to loop clips of soldiers from other countries training on Belarusian soil with bombastic commentary about brotherhood in arms and a new multipolar world. For Moscow, the optics matter more than the actual drills. The other audience is, of course, NATO. Every Zapad cycle comes with scenarios that are thinly veiled rehearsals for fighting the West. In the past, exercises have included simulated nuclear strikes on Warsaw or amphibious landings in the Baltics. The message here is also clear. Russia wants NATO to know it can escalate, even if the real army is bleeding in Ukraine. But there is a paradox here. The more Russia talks up Zapad, the more it exposes its own weaknesses. Western intelligence agencies will be watching carefully, not just the scripted maneuvers, but also the performance of Russian units. Can they coordinate across branches? Do they still have functioning logistics? These drills are a stage, yes, but one where the cracks are hard to hide. Belarus, meanwhile, plays the role of junior partner and loyal stagehand. Hosting Zapad allows Alexander Lukashenko to showcase his usefulness to Putin. Belarusian troops drill side by side with the Russians, and Minsk insists it's defending the Union state. But everyone knows what this really is. Belarus lending its territory to Moscow so that Russia can look bigger than it actually is. So, NATO has to walk a fine line, monitor the Zapad exercises without overreacting, deter without escalating. This is exactly the balance Russia hopes to upset. By flexing during the exercises, Moscow wants to remind Europe, we can threaten you even while fighting a war elsewhere. The real question is whether anyone still believes it. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Anaïs Marin, Associate Fellow at Chatham House. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So the Zapad military exercises, this is not the first time that they are taking place. What makes them different this year?
Indeed, Zapad is being held every 2 years on Belarusian soil since 2009. What is specific, I guess, this year is that there are much less numerous presence of troops, notably Russian troops, than in 2021, which we remember was rehearsal and preparing the ground for the actual full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which indeed started partially from the territory of Belarus. This year, according to Lithuanian available intelligence reports, there is about 30,000 troops taking part, which is much less than the almost 200,000 of 2021-2022.
So it's not massive. However, it did have a substantial impact on the public opinion in the West. Everyone is watching these exercises very closely. Why do you think is that the case? And would you say that perhaps this is also what Moscow really wants us to do?
Of course, any military drills is causing concern for neighboring states in the context when a war is actually taking place at the same time at our borders. And this is why probably Russia has not communicated much on these drills. Belarus has been trying to be a bit more transparent. It's a division of task, I believe. In fact, they are very well coordinated, and the Zapad 2025 really intends to send several messages. First, of course, there is the trial and simulation test of new weapons, and we're expecting the Oreshnik long-range missile, which is nuclear capable, to be tested, if not launched altogether. Then there is also, as announced by the Ministry of Defense of Belarus, the planned test of nuclear weapons. Again, this is just all simulation, and we're talking about the tactical nuclear weapons which have been deployed by Russia on Belarusian territory. And one element which I think is important to notice is also that alongside the regional grouping of troops of Belarus and Russia, which will be training jointly this week, there are also several guest countries taking part in a so-called coalition group of troops, which is also present, including with forces from India, from Tajikistan, from several African countries too.
Should we be worried in particular about India? Because you've mentioned that, and now a few commentators already said, look, you're taking part in military exercises which involve a simulated nuclear attack on a European country. Isn't that something that should perhaps cause, if not a diplomatic scandal, then at least perhaps a discreet conversation between certain people in high places?
It's not up to me to say if it's scandalous, but I hope this conversation is taking place indeed. From what I know, the Indian troops are actually not in Belarus, but in Nizhny Novgorod on the training grounds, which are on Russian territory, because these exercises are not taking place only in Belarus or in Kaliningrad, but also on Russian soil and also on the Baltic and Barents Sea up to Pechenga, which is in the Murmansk Oblast of Russia. So we shouldn't focus too much on the ground situation, and notably the famous Suwałki corridor, which the drills will try to conquer in an attempt to link the Belarusian territory with Kaliningrad to bridge that gap, and which is of course a source of paranoia for NATO countries, because that would leave the Baltic states isolated from Poland and from the mainland Europe. Although after the joining of Sweden and Finland, this is much less of a concern now. But again, part of the drills are taking place on the Aquatoria, on the Baltic and Barents Sea, and this should not be underestimated, because these days, as we know, the Russian fleet also has a presence in these seas, which is a source of concern and can be also a launching pad for missiles or drones, for that matter.
Now, these exercises have always had a touch of the sinister about them. Probably most people in Poland, for example, first learned about their existence about a decade ago, perhaps a bit earlier, when all of a sudden it was announced that Russia is conducting military exercises with a simulated nuclear tactical attack against one of major Polish cities. And this sparked an enormous debate. Also, later on, we had a similar debate when Russia actually invaded Ukraine for the first time, 2014. All the newspapers were covering the movements of the Russian fleet, thinking perhaps this is a prelude to a wider war. Do you think that the Russians are playing us with these unfriendly and very concerning gestures, and that they are perhaps trying to draw our attention to something, or maybe away from something? What do you think about this?
I believe you're right. This is very complex issues, but as we know, hybrid warfare and intimidation, disinformation, propaganda is just part of the normal way of war, and Russia is no different from that perspective. What it is doing, however, is its utmost to paralyze us, to impress and deter the Western coalition of the willing, the NATO member states, in order to really paralyze action and decision making, using notably this saber rattling and the nuclear blackmail, whereas those a bit informed about nuclear warfare, it's not really my case, but I have read a bit about this. It cannot be seriously taken into consideration the possibility of a nuclear strike in the current context. However, it's part of Russia's attempts, of course, to deter us from supporting Ukraine, from further building up our own military strength nearer to the border, to use this nuclear blackmail almost on a daily basis.
But speaking of a conventional conflict, what do you think this might actually look like? Because some people say, well, Russia is never as strong, nor is it as weak as it seems. So there is this lack of transparency. We never know what Russia is really capable of. Given the latest developments, so Sweden and Finland joining NATO, Ukraine still fighting back, actually reducing Russia's capability of marketing, its petroleum products by destroying or damaging refineries, but also, as you said, the rearmament of the Russian army itself, which has taken substantial casualties and losses. Where would you say do we actually stand? What would be the likely scenario for a confrontation of this kind? Will it be hybrid warfare, kinetic warfare, an all-out war? What do you think?
Well, the likelihood of a conflict doesn't mean the likelihood of Russia winning it. And here I think we should be confident in our own strengths, at least militarily, and in the fact that Russia is absolutely able to shoot itself in the foot. And if appropriate economic sanctions are implemented and loopholes are patched, there is high chances that we don't reach that 3-5 year when Russia would be in a position to attack. It will have collapsed as an economic system because this system is not sustainable in the long run. This current war economy, as we see it, is not sustainable. However, that again requires strong commitment to the implementation of sanctions, especially in the oil field, and us really beefing up our attempts at terminating the bypassing of sanctions, and notably with this the Russian ghost fleet. As for the confrontation, it is here to stay, and we have to be prepared for it. And what I can notice, being from Western Europe but living in Poland myself, and earlier than that, having lived in Finland several years, is that the nearer to the border, the more prepared the society is. And here I think everybody in Europe and in NATO should look at the best practices developed by the Finnish society and government with this so-called whole of society approach to security. This is how you build a strong territorial defense, how you build a strong reserve, and how you prepare your civil society to resisting any kind of aggression, which, as we know these days, and especially coming from Russia, will not be only conventional, but also mostly non-conventional, and is going on as we speak, and can take several aspects, including cyber warfare, disinformation, destabilization of any kind, and interference in domestic affairs, including elections. We've seen this, it's going on, and it is not going to stop. In fact, we have evidence that it is increasing. There is an Uberization of the use of low-cost, not even Russian agents for the implementation of sabotage operations and even targeted killings all through Europe. These are things for which we have to be prepared and beef our societies against, because we should not let ourselves be intimidated by such actions, and we should not resort to similar warfare because this is contrary to our own democratic European values.
Anna Ismahan was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. A divide is beginning to form between the Kremlin and Russia's economic expert community. The recent clash between the Russian president and the country's top banker has led to concerns over whether Russian authorities can handle the country's straining economy.
Sberbank CEO German Gref recently warned Vladimir Putin that Russia's GDP growth slowed to near zero in July and August, following a sharp drop in the year's second quarter. The banker stated that the Russian economy had essentially stagnated in that period. Putin remained unconvinced, claiming that the slowdown was merely a, quote, soft landing, meant to stabilize prices. This rare public clash, experts believe, has revealed a deep divide between Russia's leadership and the country's leading financial specialists when it comes to the real costs that Russia has been paying for its war in Ukraine. Official data shows that Russia's GDP grew by 1.1% year-on-year in the second quarter, down from 1.4% in Q1, and much lower than the 4.3% and 5.4% rates from the same periods in 2024.
Ukraine continues to make Russia pay dearly for its years-long strikes against its infrastructure. A Ukrainian drone recently crashed into one of Russia's largest oil refining complexes.
The complex that was hit by the Ukrainian drone lies some 1,400 kilometers away from the front line in Ukraine and on the outskirts of the Russian city of Ufa. The attack was confirmed by Russian regional authorities, who said that one drone had crashed into a plant while another was shot down. No casualties or injuries have been officially reported. The site itself has reportedly sustained minor damage involving a fire. Since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Moscow's forces have been going after Ukrainian infrastructure sites. Kiev has recently been responding with intensified efforts which have been targeting the Kremlin's ability to fund the war. A wave of Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries over the summer has been successful at hindering processing capacity at several sites, which has in turn affected fuel prices across the entire Russian Federation.
Uzbekistan is preparing to carry out its first census since the fall of the Soviet Union. The topic had been taboo under the country's first post-Soviet leader, who had held authoritarian levels of power.
In a bid to guide Uzbekistan's economic transformation, the government is setting up to conduct its first census to gain precise demographic data since 1989. One of the most controversial issues surrounding Uzbekistan's demographics are the hundreds of thousands of Uzbeks who travel abroad each year in search of work. While the country's population is estimated to have grown on a yearly basis, the exact population has been difficult to discern due to this outflow of workers. Labour migration has been a key reason why a census has not been conducted since Islam Karimov had taken power in 1991. Karimov, who died in 2016, had refused to even hear about the issue. His successor, Vladimir Putin, had tried to conduct a census in 2022, but the plans were delayed due to the coronavirus pandemic.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.